Hello, I'm Kylotl, and in this video I'm going to be going in depth over the trailer for Refraction Railway 2 and talk about all four of the abnormalities shown: Steam Transport Machine, Wayward Passenger, Faelantern, and the Rose Sign. I'll go after what they're based off of, how their fights are likely to go on, and more speculation type stuff. So, let's just get started in the order in which the abnormalities were shown, which means first up is the Steam Transport Machine. The Steam Transfer Machine is an abnormality that debuted in Mirror Dungeon 1. It is a very special case, as an aberration of a donator abnormality from Lobotomy Corporation called the Backwards Clock. For those of you who don't know what a donator abnormality means, basically people who helped fund LobCorp a certain amount early in its development got to get their own custom abnormalities into the game. Due to the fact that none of the donator abnormalities made a reappearance in Ruina, and the fact that their nature of not being initially created by Project Moon themselves, the fanbase widely considered them to be non-canon. But now, thanks to the existence of mirror worlds and abnormalities from other mirror worlds slipping in through the mirror dimensions, we can now tell that donator abnos are canon in at least one of the dimensions, if not the main one. The Backwards Clock was an abnormality which contained the power to go back in time in a day in exchange for the life of a high-level employee. It already seemed to be related to Time Trek, which is T-Corp, before we saw them directly due to Time Trek having control over time and specifically the ability to rewind time through TT2, similar to the Backwards Clock. But now that we know that Time Trek has a very steampunky vibe to them, it's pretty much undeniable. And this also, of course, translates back to the Steam Transport Machine. Looking at the trailer itself, the observation log quote for the Steam Transport Machine, which is pretty unmistakably written by Dawn, says, "Lo, this machine is like a colossal factory given free will, is it not? Forsooth, 'tis quite the fetching specimen." And colossal it is. From later on in the trailer, we can see that this machine is roughly 4 times the height of Faust, making it the first time we're going to get a proper fight against a massive opponent after, the non-fight against Baba Yaga kinda failed in that regards. This quote also gives us a very good sense of what the abnormality is exactly, as it's some kind of time track equipment, possibly a byproduct of the singularity, that is used for the sake of transporting goods managed to gain sentience somehow. And if we look at the background, we can see the fight takes place in a factory area, and of course we do know T-Corp has a lot of factories from Kanto 4, and it has a similar color scheme to that of T-Corp's district, although it's a little brighter than the sepia that the rest of what we've seen had. Next up, let's try and figure out just exactly what the Steam Transport Machine's gimmick is going to be in its fight. Now, its ego gift is the Nixie Divergence, which inflicts 4 tremor with 4 count to all opponents, which makes it seem like it may end up being a tremor-based fight, although I don't expect this to be the main gimmick, but just a minor part of it. The Abno also is shown to be shooting smoke at Faust with one of its attacks, which could indicate a poise gimmick or possibly the return of smoke from Ruina for all we know. Now, as much as I want smoke to return, it does feel like it's been replaced by poise due to poise's smoke-like appearance, so I wouldn't bet on it. And it's definitely important to consider that just because it is a smoky attack, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to have some sort of poise or smoke gimmick to it. It could very well just be a strong attack. Chances are, however, the Steam Transfer Machine is going to take after the T-Corp Collector's scene in Kanto 4's dungeon, being reliant on charge and having a few special status effects of their own. Notably interlocking time and borrowed time, which are both being shown on screen right now. Now, both of these are very interesting gimmicks that are very underused due to T-Corp only showing up 2 or 3 times in the Kanto 4 dungeon, but I could definitely see them being used in this fight to some degree. But if we want to look at a gimmick proper for the Steam Transport Machine, let's take a look at its encounter in Mirror Dungeon 1. You're given the option to order the abnormality to carry luggage, and if you succeed, the count on its body goes up by 1, and it hands you one of its Nixie tubes and gets a new one itself. This Nixie tube, of course, being the Nixie Divergence that is the ego gift given by the Steam Transfer Machine. My best guess on how this could work in a fight is that maybe there's going to be some certain strong skill the Steam Transfer Machine uses every once in a while, and if you beat in a clash or something similar like that, then its count will go up by 1. And once you do that 4 times, it'll get fully staggered, similar to the 4 Nixie tubes present on the Steam Transport Machine. This is just a guess, but it's almost certainly going to have something to do with winding up the abnormality in order to stagger it, similar to how you need to wind up the Backwards Clock 4 times before you get to trigger its effects, actually. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this abnormality is the introduction order of the fights. If it does actually mean that the order in which the abnormals are shown is the order they're going to be fought in the Refraction Railway, this does mean the steam printer machine is going to be the first of the four to show up. So it's likely to not have any super specific gimmicks that require you to change your playstyle dramatically. Just a simple gimmick in order to have a way to stagger the abnormality, and some status effects it'll have in order to make itself more of a threat. Think similar to the Blubbering Toad, although hopefully not as much of a damage sponge, although this is a Refraction Railway, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. But let's move on to the next abnormality, the Wayward Passenger. Despite what the Wayward Passenger's name states, they're not a passenger of a warp train, but instead are one of the warp cleanup crew members that was somehow left behind, stuck between dimensions. We've already seen a fair bit of what this abno is capable of already, through having two egos from it, specifically Yisong and Honglu's Dimension Shredder egos. The observation log for this abnormality, written by Mersault based on the dry style of writing, provides very little extra information, just stating that one may extrapolate from the color and style of the clothing this entity holds a certain connection to W Corp, which really is helpful. Thank you, Mersault. Very cool. The glimpse we see of it in action in the trailer shows it attacking in a very near identical mechanic to that of the Dimension Shredder egos, warping through dimensional rifts and stabbing people with its sharp arms. Now, the Wayward Passenger's ego gift is the blue Zippo lighter, which just gives a gloom resource and two other random resources every turn. While this provides very little info on what the gimmick is, as it's unlikely to be some sort of gloom resource-based fight, both the Dimension Shredder egos have a focus on charge and rupture, and so do all the warp identities in the first place, so it's pretty determined that that's going to be the main focus. But for the main gimmick of the fight itself, I'm going to go on a limb for this, but I've got an idea in my mind just about what this fight may consist of. Part of the uniqueness of Refraction Railway is that all fights take place as focused encounters, so you get to choose your targets, even against normal enemies. I believe that the Wayward Passenger is going to be played like a relatively normal fight compared to most abnormalities. It's the most human-like abno we've fought yet, and there's a very high chance it won't be fighting alone. Either there's going to be some normal warp cleanup agents alongside it, or other Wayward Passengers who have been stuck in between dimensions due to warp's general discontempt of human life, and the city as a whole's discontempt of human life. Personally, I'm definitely expecting the latter. There's a decent chance in this situation that there still will be a single main Wayward Passenger, and the others will be some weaker versions with different names, but it's still of similar charge and rupture-focused natures. Think about how, like, say, the Pinocchio fight in Runa, how there was one big Pinocchio and two smaller Pinocchios. Certainly an interesting avenue to choose for comparison, but I guess it works. Given how many warp identities we've seen already, I can definitely see Project Moon using this chance provided by the Wayward Passenger in order to get some more standard warp enemies into the game. But all in all, I think this one's probably going to be as simple as the fight. If this order given in the trailer isn't right, then I'd expect this to be the first one possibly and not the Steam Transport Machine, although I do think the order was most likely the actual order we'll be fighting them in the Refraction Railway. But I think this is going to be a relatively grounded, normal fight. But then, let's move on to something that's absolutely going to be pretty much the polar opposite of a normal fight, the Faelantern. The Faelantern is the only one of the abnos in Refraction Railway 2 that doesn't originate from Mirror Dungeon 1, instead existing only as an ego when the game launched through Gregor's Lantern ego and later on being added as an event abnormality in Mirror Dungeon 2. The Faelantern is another aberration of a LobCorp abnormality, this time being a pretty visually distinct but mechanically similar version of the Meat Lantern. Both abnos consist of a horrifying underground creature that lures people in through a bait that shows up above ground. They also have the exact same name for their ego, being Lantern. Now, the Faelantern is also interesting in how it seems to be one of the 5 fairy abnormalities we've seen in the series so far, those being the Fairy Festival from LobCorp, which is pretty much the original, Titania from Wonderlab, which was an Aleph fairy-themed abno, and then of course Fairy Gentleman, Fairy Longlegs, and Faelantern in Limbus. There's a decent chance there's going to be some sort of special interaction between some of the fairy abnormalities in the distant future, possibly like Apocalypse Bird or Magical Girls, but that's off topic and I just wanted to make sure I bring it up. Especially because this is going to be the 3rd fairy abno we're going to be able to physically fight so far in Limbus so early on. Now, for this observation log quote, it's written by Otis, and in it she states that such deceptive traps were often used in numerous battles I've participated in. Install something to draw in the attention of your enemies and ambush them from where they least expect. It's a rather rudimentary trap. Even the Mirror Dungeon 2 event for the Faelantern rewards you for leaving without interacting with the Abno and approaching it, results in purely negative rewards. As far as mechanics go, the basic gist is very clear. You need to be very careful not to fall for the bait that is the fairy, whether this will be done through it having some sort of hard-hitting counter, which may be the attack being shown in the trailer right here, possibly a counter mass attack, or through some other various methods unknown. There's definitely a fight that'll make the most out of the various body parts abnormalities have, probably requiring you to break the fairy itself before you can start going for the roots below, or whatever it is exactly that the Abno is behind the surface. The Midwinter Nightmare is the ego gift obtained from the Faelantern, and on top of being a very clear reference to A Midsummer's Night Dream, which is the story that Titania originates from, it makes it so all attacks inflict a bit of sinking. Gregor's Lantern Ego, on the other hand, has the primary purpose of healing up Gregor with some very minor rupture synergy. From this, it seems very likely that the Faelantern itself will absolutely have a way of healing itself, likely as a way of punishing you for failing its gimmick, and will probably inflict a little bit of sinking and maybe rupture as well. I'm not so certain about the rupture solely because then 3 out of the 4 abnormalities will be rupture-related in some form, which seems like overkill, and Faelantern is the one of the 3 that seems the most likely to have little to no rupture usage. Definitely going to be interesting how exactly they interpret such an idea as the bait into a fight, but it'll be interesting nonetheless. But now we get to move on to the 4th abnormality, and what seems to be the final boss of Refraction Railway 2, the Rose Sign. While the Rose Sign isn't a particularly threatening name, it is the 4th of the Abnos shown for Refraction Railway 2, and will likely be the final boss. Based on this, the Rose Sign is most likely going to be the 3rd VoV Abno we get to fight in Limbus, following Ebony Queen's Apple and My Form Empties. But the strange thing about the Rose Sign is how, unlike the other 3 abnormalities in Refraction Railway 2, we know next to nothing about what it is. We don't have any egos from it yet, and it doesn't seem to be any sort of obvious aberration, at least at first glance, but there are some glaring similarities that may guide us into getting a good sense as to what this fleshy rose mass could be. For the Abno's observation log quote, we get a very traditional British accent saying, "It's all sunshine and rainbows with you, innit, gardener, piece of art? What's wrong with you? It's a monster that skewers people." Which seems to be implying that Heathcliff is getting annoyed at, likely Ryoshu, for comparing the rose sign to art. Well, this really doesn't say too much. If it was enough for Ryoshu to be complimenting its artwork, it's certainly going to be horrible in nature. Looking at the Mirror Dungeon 1 event, when you choose the option to pick a rose, you see that with closer examination, you notice that it has an intestinal texture. What is a flower-shaped organ for? Showing these flowers are not flowers at all, and instead an extension of the mass of flesh that is bound within the thorns. There are also several eyes present in the mass of the flesh, looking out in every single direction. Now, a quick warning before I get into this, that I'm going to be delving into some heavy LobCorp spoilers here, and even if you don't care too much about spoilers, the next section may not make too much sense for anyone who is a Limbus only, so go to this timestamp here if you don't feel the need to get the in-depth theory crafting. It's also going to be based on some pretty loose connections since we have little to no info on this thing yet, so we will just see how likely this ends up being. Going over the possible connections the rose sign might end up having, the one that stands out the most to me is the connections it has to Jesus, the wooden cross gravestone that the Mound of Flesh has been bound to, and the fact that the ego gift itself is a crown of thorns. Now, the rose sin isn't the first abnormality to have some Jesus parallels, with the other one being one sin and hundreds of good deeds, the very first abnormality present in every run in Lobotomy Corporation. While at first the connections between the two don't seem to be too direct beyond their shared basis on Jesus, it runs a little deeper. For this we're going to be talking about the other connection present with the rose sign, that being the roses themselves and what they stand for. Lunacy, the premium currency in Limbus, is a not-so-vague embodiment of Carmen from Lobotomy Corporation. Carmen is the voice that is heard by anyone who's going to distort or manifest ego of their own, which is seen very briefly in Limbus when Don Grang talks to Carmen by name before manifesting Farmwatch. Carmen's entire principle is that in order to suppress the disease of the mind that she sought to cure, people need to open their eyes, so to speak, whether that be through distortion or ego. This is also very present when you read the description for Lunacy and Limbus, which you can actually read the description for Lunacy in the actual items section on the main menu. Not something I don't think too many people have knowledge, but it states that embracing the madness is a necessary step for humans to move forwards, which very much seems to embody this whole idea of, like, this distortion must be embraced by humanity in order to progress past the disease of the mind. And on top of that, Carmen is even present in the design of Lunacy itself, as the stem of the rose is very similar to that of a nervous system, which is what Carmen is reduced to after her death and used by the Lobotomy Corporation as their singularity, also referred to as the bucket. Now that that's made very clear to those who are unaware of the specifics of Carmen and Lunacy, the connections to the rose sign are not too apparent beyond the presence of roses, but here's where One Sin comes back into play. One Sin is a representation of Ayin, and its counterpart, White Knight, is representative of Carmen. So now that we see an abnormality that seems to be a mixture of One Sin through the Jesus symbolism and Carmen through the roses, this means that it may be a One Sin aberration after all, and that later on there may be a White Knight aberration that represents Ayin in order for there to be a little bit of a reverse plate on them, which could prove to be very interesting. But this is all speculation, of course. It would be very strange to see our One Sin / White Knight aberrations so early, given that they are some of the most crucial abnos in the series story-wise, but there does seem to be quite a few things that would fall into place from this theory. But that's enough of my theory crafting, so let's get back into the actual speculation on what the fight itself is going to consist of. Getting to the Abno fight itself, as previously mentioned, we know painfully little about what the Rose Sign will do. Its ego gift, Crown of Roses, inflicts some rupture on one enemy every turn and inflicts rupture on all enemies when you get a Gluttony Absolute Resonance. The most important thing for figuring out how this fight exactly is going to go, however, is this one very blurry image we see during the trailer. Right after seeing a clip where a group of sinners get hit by a mass attack by the Rose Sign, this blurry image of a corroded Hong Lu shows up. There's seemingly two possibilities. Either this is a new ego for Hong Lu being added around the same time as Refraction Railway 2, which seems unlikely, or this is part of the Rose Sign's gimmick, turning some of your sinners into minions of its own. The question whether or not this is a punishment for failing to beat the mass attack, or if it happens no matter what, is not clear here, but I think there's a very good chance they're not going to have a choice and will have to force someone to take this hit. Which does tie back into the White Knight side of this abnormality, if that is true, with the White Knight's own personal apostles. The most interesting thing about this image that makes it the hardest to figure out what exactly is happening to Hong Lu is the fact that despite seeming like he's been taking over the enemy, he's still facing to the right. Normally that would mean he's still a normal sinner, as while there are occasions where due to positioning, one of your units will flip which direction you face, that doesn't ever happen in these promotional videos when you see attacks. This may support the idea that Hong Lu is getting Rose Sign ego, or it could mean that this abnormality has the ability to make your units corrode. Not into one of their own ego corrosions, however, instead into the Rose Sign's gimmick corrosion. This is a pretty big leap to take based on a single right-facing sprite, as it could just be that Hong Lu is on the opposite opponent's side still, but just looks right in order to be facing the abnormality he is revering in the first place. And in which case this entire point would be moot, but this is something to think about. We're gonna have to wait and see just how this fight will go. As odd of a choice it seems at first glance, after my research and speculation, I think that it may end up as an incredibly interesting fight, both in story and in gameplay. But that's gonna be all for this video. I'm gonna be streaming Refraction Railway 2 as soon as it releases on the 13/14th, depending on your time zone, at 10 PM Central Standard Time, so feel free to join in when that happens. But yeah, that'll be all for this time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!